Hello, everyone. I'm John McDonald. This is Everything is Gay, even the straight stuff, special edition. And what makes this special is that my usual co host, Magnus, is not here, but I have a fabulous extra special co host. These special editions of Everything is Gay, even the straight stuff is to kind of do something a little bit extra, give a little bit of extra rhythm. And so I've asked people to come on that have a passion about something. And the first person to agree to this, thankfully, is my friend Jack. Hello, Jack. Please introduce
Hi.
yourself to the audience.
Hi, my name is Jack. I'm a poet and artist here in Portland, Oregon, and recently also voice actor. I'm a spooky cosmic narrator in John's other podcast, Surf City.
Yes, Surf City Donuts, where the donuts are always fresh and the town is just not quite right. And speaking of towns that are not quite right, we're going to be talking about one of both of our favorite movies, 1996's The Craft. And though it takes place in Los Angeles, something's really not right in Los Angeles. This isn't Bring It On. It's like the opposite, where she's moving into LA instead of out. So this is 96's The Craft, which is considered a cult classic, even though it was a critical success the year it came out. In fact, is in the top 8 list of movies that feature witches, actually, based on how much money it made. So what when I offered you this, you were like, let's talk about The Craft. So what made you want to kind of talk about The Craft?
So I have a bit of a fun story with this movie. I actually had to fight tooth and nail to get my parents to let me see it. I just sort of knew intrinsically that there was something in this movie that I needed to see. And I turned out to be very correct about that. So for me, this movie is sort of realizing I was queer and being called to become a witch happened at the same time. So those two things are kind of interconnected.
So let's start with I want everyone to get a real sense of this. So if you haven't seen the poster for the 96 Craft, and I like this poster much better than the Craft Legacy poster, actually. So if you haven't seen the poster of these four women walking the runway toward you with the lightning behind them, this is an amazing poster. Um, you see they got the Catholic schoolgirl skirts, and they're all kind of moving in unison, though Robin Tunney, who plays the newcomer, is just slightly behind them, and they've got that crackling electricity, and it's kind of this purple and gray scale with a nice big shadow on the bottom. And it has the best tagline ever. The Craft, if you watch the trailer, the tagline is "Exercise Your Rights," spelled RITS. I don't know if you remember the trailer for this movie, but the trailer is fantastic. It's so 96.
Mhm. Yeah, I never saw the trailer. I think I first watched this movie in the early 2000s. I would have been, I think, 4 when it came out.
So did you see it? So we often talk here on Everything is Gay about medium. So what was the medium you saw it on? Was it like on TV? So there were commercials? Was it on in like a special edition anniversary screening or at like a small movie theater? Like how did you first see The Craft?
Um, well, in the most early 2000s kind of a way, I rented it from Blockbuster.
Oh, that's so good though. Anyone that knows me knows one of my favorite scenes is Ethan Hawke in Ethan Hawke's version of Hamlet, where he's roaming a blockbuster doing the to be or not to be speech. So I have a special place in my heart for Blockbuster. And that's also really cool because Blockbuster also represents a bygone ritual now, since we don't really have a big Blockbuster like movie rental places anymore. Is the ritual of going and picking out your movie as a physical object and bringing it home. Did you feel the power of the ritual getting The Craft, or was it like you had to like smuggle it in your jacket and run to the car with it kind of thing?
Not much ritual in my first watching. I think my parents finally let me watch it, so I'd shut up about it. Yeah. And there was kind of this persistent threat that my parents might shut the movie off at any time, which they didn't, at least.
Yeah.
It wasn't till later when I was able to actually watch it by myself that it really sunk in.
Yeah. And The Craft does share a couple of things with Charmed,
Mhm.
both in kind of the location and in the music, because the Charmed theme, their version of the what is the song? I wrote this. I looked it up so I could have the song ready, and I can't find it now.
Oh, it's
Uh,
now.
yeah. So the version of How Soon Is Now that was done by the Smiths, that was covered by Love Spit Love, is both the version of How Soon Is Now that is in the trailer for The Craft and is a big part of the movie, but was also the opening for Charmed. So it's the same cover. It's not nobody's doing the original Smiths version for this movie.
Mhm. Wonder if that was a copyright thing. Hmm.
There were some copyright issues. There are actually two versions of the soundtrack for this movie. One which features a lot more of the instrumental, and one which features a lot more of the music. And there were a few different copyright things because they have a lot of like, I'm gonna butcher this name because I always butcher this name. See You and the Banshees are here. Portishead is here. There's Space Hog, Heather Nova, Letters to Cleo. There's even an uncredited bonus track that you can only find on one of the film score soundtracks, and Wikipedia is not accurate on which one, I don't think. Um, but
Yeah.
music is a
Um,
big part of this movie because it was in '96. So
yeah, 90s alt rock is basically a character.
it
But
is.
yeah, in my physical copy of the soundtrack, the Susie and the Banshees and Portishead songs are not present.
Yeah. And The Craft does share some '90s, not just alt rock, but '90s location, because you kind of have like a Catholic school motif in '90s teen films. I'm thinking specifically of Cruel Intentions, which is the other kind of big drama, death at the end film. Um,
Mhm.
did you ever see Cruel Intentions or another film with heavy Catholic imagery and think this is kind of like The Craft?
No, I haven't seen Cruel Intentions.
Oh, Ryan Phillippe gets run over with the car, and then everyone is sad. If you've never seen it, Sarah Michelle Gellar spends the entire movie. Her character spends the entire movie in some version of a kind of a drugged state. Like she has like a thing in her crucifix with like a popper inside of it. And like the ending scene is her basically like sniffing something in a bathroom before she's outed for being terrible. Um, but Cruel Intentions is a completely different movie, and we'll talk about it. So before we dive into The Craft, I want to kind of give viewers some context because it's always context here, and everything is gay and the straight stuff. So in '96, we had a whole bunch of big budget tentpoles in '95. The Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie, Jumanji, um, Batman Forever, my favorite Batman film, are all '95. These are all big blockbusters. This comes out the year after in May of '96. So this was a summer movie, and it made, people are surprised by this, that it made 55.6 million worldwide, and it only cost 15 million to make. Um,
From what I understand, it was kind of a sleeper hit.
It was. Roger Ebert hated it. He actually he liked the first half of the movie, and then by the time they're like in the apocryphal final battle, he's like, and now it's noisy instead of something with substance. Which I disagree, but I often
Hmm.
disagree with Roger Ebert. So I don't know that I think this movie was made for him necessarily, because movies aren't always made for everyone. Especially this movie has a really interesting point of view that we see both with the producer and the director and other bodies of work they have. Have
Hmm.
you watched anything else by any of the either the producer or the writer of this film?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so the only credit that Andrew Fleming really has that is pretty close to this is the 2007 Nancy Drew movie with Emma Roberts before she was part of the Ryan Murphy Scream Queens coterie.
Hmm.
Um, And there's a lot of people in this movie that are really good actors that were not served by this movie. But the Nancy Drew remake was his. Um, the Douglas Wick, who's the film producer, worked on films like Gladiator, Memoirs of a Geisha, but in the case of The Craft, the kind of three movies that are closest spiritually are the movie he did in '88, which was Working Girl, with Harrison Ford and Melanie Griffith. Girl Interrupted from '99, he had a hand in, which, if you like Winona Ryder, Angelina Jolie, or Clea Duvall, you probably saw. And also the 2013 Tobey Maguire, Leo DiCaprio Great Gatsby film. So in the body of work, that's the context for Andrew Fleming and Douglas Wick.
Hmm. I actually haven't seen any of those.
Oh, and the other writer, Filardi, who did films. Maybe you saw Filardi's film. So the first film that Filardi ever sold was Flatliners, which has to do with medical students that discover what happens after you die by flatlining. So I know you have a love for horror movies. So if you've seen Flatliners, you've actually seen part of the body of work here.
I'm trying to think if I have. It sounds familiar.
Kiefer Sutherland was in it, so it's one of the Kiefer Sutherland horror films, I guess. But the thing about it is that Flatliners is also about people filled with arrogance,
Mhm.
and people that consider themselves like hot shot and rise to the top. And you see that the idea of arrogance, because arrogance is kind of the downfall of some of the characters inside of the craft. Would you agree with that? Do you think arrogance is a problem, or what was kind of the cause of the downfall? I mean, obviously, it's the spell gone awry. Um, it's the judgment from their god, more or less, and how they abuse their powers. But was it hubris that brought Nancy down, or was it something else completely?
I would say in part hubris, but more than that, the desire for a quick fix, the desire to snap your fingers and make everything better. And there's actually a point pretty early in the film where Sarah tells her that's not how that works. And Nancy doesn't listen.
So interestingly, Peter Filardi says that Nancy is the one character everyone wants to be, which the subtext is that most of us are not Nancy, most of us are Bonnie, Rochelle, or Sarah, or possibly we're Skeet Ulrich's character Chris. And I think this is before he had done, because this comes before Scream, so I don't think Skeet Ulrich had done Scream with Matthew Lillard yet. So
I think it's interesting he got typecast as the boyfriend in 90s horror movies.
he did become kind of the Resequit bad boy boyfriend. It's very outsiders, but it's outsiders if they actually had carnal relations with each other instead of just teasing it for 2 hours. And I
Hmm.
think with the craft, there is an explicitness to this movie. This is easily one of the darkest films that I enjoy. It's right up there with my other favorite Fairuza Balk film, which is Return to Oz, when she was like the youngest actress in Hollywood ever, besides Drew Barrymore. And so, especially for Fairuza Balk, you almost expect her to be cast as Nancy. I feel like I don't think when I looked at the Wikipedia, it seemed like she was the only one where it was like, yes, this person is going to be Nancy.
Yeah, I know this was before Scream, right?
This is before. So Scream is like a weird movie where it's So no, Scream One is '96, but I think it was probably not a summer film. Let me look and see when exactly it was released, because that's the one thing Wikipedia really gets right. So in '96, it was released. There's the plot. When was it filmed? So it actually was shopped around Hollywood at the same time as The Craft. Um, and it looks like it took longer to cast. Uh, so Skeet Ulrich was cast because of his resemblance to Johnny Depp in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Um, and apparently, Kraft finished right before Scream started filming. So it goes Kraft and then Scream. So Skeet was kind of building this
Was
brand.
sort
Also, Breckin Meyer was almost cast in the Jamie Kennedy role. So Breckin Meyer was almost the Randy Meeks character.
hmm, interesting. I wonder what sort of Hollywood machinations found Neve Campbell and sort of propelled her to scream queendom in the space of this 1 year.
Well, it's not just this, because she'd also done kind of the sexy noir, neo noir thriller Wild Things with Denise Richards and Kevin Bacon. So her body of work in the 90s all had this kind of dangerous, glossy, sexy, crazy, beautiful vibe to it in my mind. When I think of Neve Campbell, I really do think more of Wild Things than Scream, even sometimes. In '96, all the teens were doing sexy witchcraft in '96. That was what was happening in the world, in America, in Los Angeles. Um, what's interesting is that this movie, unlike Child's Play at the beginning of the '90s, essentially doesn't set off a satanic panic. This is more seen as a teen movie. Like Beetlejuice, it has multi-genre, so feels it feels like it should have set off some sort of panic, and it didn't. There's enough stories, especially from behind the scenes, from the Wiccan that was hired to make sure everything was respectful, to just the story of when they're like reciting spells, like the tide washes away the altar in the scene where they do it on the beach. Um, and so you'd think this movie would set off a bit of a satanic panic, but it doesn't.
Well,
Or if it did, it wasn't memorable enough to even make it in the Wikipedia page, and normally that gets into like a Wikipedia page entry at least.
well, there was a little bit of it in how the movie was treated by the studios and especially the MPAA. Um,
Yes.
Nuggets of information I got from the director's commentary was that the director and the writer were going really hard for a PG-13 rating. And so there were a lot of things that they either toned down or edited out of the film so that I could be PG-13. And then when they got it back from the MPAA, they were told that the film had to be rated R because it was about teenagers practicing witchcraft.
Yes. Um, and their mentor, who they don't listen to, who also practices witchcraft, who was played by who played the mentor?
Oh yeah, Assumpta Serna. Apparently she's
Yeah.
a pretty well established Hungarian actress, but I haven't seen anything else she's been in.
Yeah, Assumpta Serna. What a fantastic name! As I'm gonna butcher this name, Lirio.
Oh, that was correct.
Oh, great. So apparently, Assumpta Serna is actually a Spanish actress,
Oh,
which is super cool to know.
I think she was Hungarian.
I'm not sure. She's done a lot of different movies, but most of her movies are Spanish labeled here on IMDb, except for one blip, which is what is this movie called? Behold the Monkey from 2016, which is just a fun title for a movie. But yes, she plays the kind of white hat witch mentor to the girls that they don't listen to, and she has that really great scene actually, where Nancy is kind of really starting to go off the rails, and Lirio is desperately trying to reach Sarah, at least, who will listen to her. And I remember that in kind of, it's not the climax of the movie, but it's the midpoint turning point of the movie where her altar kind of turns white or explodes or something like that. I can't really recall what happens in the scene.
Yeah, in that scene, I think it was Nancy and company cast some sort of illusion to make Sarah think the magic shop was on fire.
Yeah. It's really it. So there are a lot of effects in this movie. But before we talk about the effects, where we talk about the plot, because we're getting there at this point, I would kind of talk about the versions of it that we have available, because we have kind of probably people that have it on VHS. I'm not one of them, but it would have been available on VHS. It would have been available on DVD, probably in Sharper, and now Shout Factory does carry it in like a 4K Blu-ray format. Have you seen the 4K Blu-ray format? Does Sharper help this movie, or is it better on a VHS tape where you can enjoy it in its kind of pre-sharpness glory?
I have a mid 2000s DVD complete with all the mid 2000s mid 2000s DVD effects, and I kind of enjoy the graininess of some of the scenes.
Let's talk about that. So, what makes I have this kind of conversation when I talk about CGI effects, especially. What makes it what makes this movie more valuable as a film where it was made in the 90s, so it wasn't made in this like crystal clear high def, you're like basically sitting in an actor's lap kind of vibe to it. What makes it better that it has that kind of older vintage feel? Vintage, oh god, 90s vintage. I feel old now.
Hmm. I think for me, because it is such a quintessentially 90s film, it sort of locates it in that context. That was how the film was made and how it would have been seen for most of its time existing.
Yeah. Until they brought it out for a Dracula episode premiere, and so they revitalized it as a scene because that is a very iconic scene, and we're going to kind of talk about this movie. I feel like the iconic scenes are there, but they also are part of moving the plot along. Um, and so we can kind of talk now. I think it would be good to talk not about the plot step by step, but to talk about kind of the four corners, the four main characters, and their kind of witch persona, and then talk about let it kind of flow from there. So we
All right.
have yeah. So which witch do you want to start with?
Hmm. We should probably start with Sarah since the story is her arc.
Okay. So do you think this whole movie that she is, I don't want to use the word important, but do you think this is Sarah's story? Like she gets swept away with everyone else in kind of this power thing, but do you feel like the story really is like this is her? If this were a slasher flick, would she be the final girl? I guess in horror parlance.
Yeah, I think she would be. And in some ways, she is, because people die around her and she's under threat of death at the end of the film, but she does survive.
So, what makes Sarah a compelling lead for you, or is she a compelling lead? Like, do you wish that she had been a little dirtier? I know. In the final climactic battle, which we'll talk about, she has a lot of strength, but up until the point where that is, she is very soft. She's not as aggressive necessarily to me as the other three as the other three witches. What do you like about Sarah? What does Sarah do for you in this film that works?
Hmm. I think the things that kind of push Sarah's character along are, I mean, she's definitely troubled the way the rest of the characters are. We're shown that she's struggled with mental illness and she's attempted suicide in the past. But at the same time, there's a little bit of a naivete to her that she kind of outgrows over the course of the film, realizing that not everyone in her life has the best interests of other people at heart.
Does that naivete work for you, even in terms of being like because she's not from a small town moving to Los Angeles. She's just from literally another part of California. Like Los Angeles and San Francisco are not that far apart that it kind of amuses me that her family's like, we're going to move you away from the bad influences in your life. We're going to go to Los Angeles from San Francisco. I'm vaguely amused by that line of reasoning. Uh, yeah.
Uh, I mean, even looking at all of the gay subtext in this film, it might be telling that they're moving her away from San Francisco.
Yeah. And the Tech Bros wouldn't have bought up San Francisco yet, so that would have been a viable move at that point. And so we can talk a little bit too about the gay subtext because this is actually one of the films where, when I say everything is gay, even the straight stuff, it's kind of tongue in cheek, and it's like looking at queerness in films where you actually have to read between the lines. There's a lot of queerness in the film, like she's going after Skeet Ulrich, but she's kind of the dom in the relationship for a while. There's always a subtext when you have a movie about a coven or a book about a coven, where there's something of a sapphic undertone. The soundtrack is about as sapphic as I'd say Tank Girl is in some way as far as soundtracks go. And so, do you think Sarah reads as queer coded, as openly queer? Uh, did you read into it as someone watching the film?
I did. Um, well, there's a definite motif of doubling between Sarah and Nancy, especially towards the end of the film, which I guess we can put a pin in.
Yeah. What do you mean by a motif of doubling? What does that mean to you?
Like there's lots of shots that involve mirrors. They're using magic to turn into one another.
Oh yeah, that's a great scene. That's the house party scene where everything really starts going wrong. If you didn't think it was bad when they're in the car, creating car crashes in major intersections in LA, then that house party leaves no doubt in your mind about that.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and there's a scene in the climax where Sarah is hiding in the mirror and she steps out of Nancy's reflection. And their big fight culminates in breaking the mirror and sort of severing this connection that they had.
So I really like that in kind of like a Wicked sort of way. It predates Wicked by so many years, but there's definitely like a Wicked subtext with Sarah being kind of this soft, almost overly femme Lilith Fair, Stevie Nicks sort of queer female character, and then Nancy who has this kind of sharpness, crazed, feral, almost Greek tragedy uh, angle to her. There's something very what's the play with any play where you have Dionysus where the women turn feral. I get a big Nancy vibe, like a big Greek tragedy Nancy vibe going on.
Yeah, like I think they're called Maenads.
That's
Yeah,
probably the right word for that. Yes.
yeah, that's a good connection. I hadn't thought of that.
No, it's really good. There's something about Nancy, and you don't, and I think it's in such sharp highlight to the other three because Nancy's ambitions aren't just more grand near the end; they're more grand at the beginning. She is, whereas whereas Rochelle and Bonnie's desires seem kind of more limited and more like just high school things. Nancy's involve like literal abuse, which is almost uncomfortably shown on screen. And her desire for power is almost about a desire for safety, but not quite because you never really feel safe with Nancy. And you kind of have to wonder why the god of the film chose Nancy over the other three, but really, she's the loudest voice in the room at the time, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. There's a scene in the ritual where she invokes Manon, where she says, "Hear me," and has to correct herself later to say, "Hear us."
Yeah, and you have to kind of catch that, but yeah, she really is sort of the Winifred Sanderson of this movie in some ways. Um, to borrow one of the other famous witch movies in Hollywood.
Yeah, and you can see in some scenes that she's definitely the ringleader of this little clique, and initially she is skeptical of Sarah because I think it's a teen girl dynamics thing, because if Sarah is their fourth, then that would disrupt her control.
And at this point, Fairuza Balk isn't really known as a powerhouse actress, but I think this movie really gave her a lot of those chops because she just goes in on this movie. I don't have any story on the costumer because people don't ever give enough credit to the costumers. But Nancy definitely of the four has the most. I don't want to call it feral style again. I don't want to use the word feral for a human female character, but like her kind of leather willow wishverse thing that she's doing where it's like both provocative but dangerous. Like if you reach out and touch the part of her body that is open and visible, like she will bite your finger off, it feels like almost.
Yeah, she definitely has a lot of that 90s black vinyl. She's very edgy.
Yes. It's also here where we could talk a little bit too about the subtext, because this is also Sarah Michelle Gellar in Cruel Intentions of the subtext of taking something religiously precious like a crucifix and like putting poppers inside it. Because I could easily see Dancy doing something like that. But I mean, it's interesting too, because when you think about it, these four who create this coven still go to a Catholic high school. They still end up going and influencing things at religious services, which is supposed to be like this taboo. And there's an irony too, because Nancy's suspicion of Sarah actually makes Sarah's spell she casts on Skeet Ulrich's Chris even stronger, especially because it happens in a church. Essentially, it's the ultimate taboo of enacting a spell that has like a scarlet letter in church bringing down the pastor sort of effect. What do you think about the idea of and this may be a much longer question, the idea of this subversive femme almost sapphic witchiness invading a traditional parochial patriarchal space they're kind of held hostage in?
Mm-hmm. There's a scene pretty early on in the film where I think it's Bonnie who says, "Man invented God. This is older than that." And so it's just sort of establishing this sort of very ancient power that human constructed religions have no power over.
Do you see that carried through in the movie? Because outside of the school, we don't really get shots of church buildings. It's really the witch shop and then places in nature where they're holding rituals. So is it significant to you that we only see the church in the context of, this school, this place where they're kind of held hostage to?
Hmm. I think so. Hmm, I hadn't thought about that before. I think it's interesting that this film conflates school and church in an almost Foucault-esque way. They're both sort of institutions of control that they're rebelling against.
Do you think if this had happened at like a school where they had pep rallies instead of church services, like if it had happened at Sunnydale, for instance, do you feel like that would have worked against the movie? Do you need the church background kind of offsetting this almost rebellious, radical, we're the weirdos vibe?
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think it would be the same without it.
Nancy as a standalone character, not including what happens to Pop, but Nancy as kind of this standalone, almost primal maniad. I'm sure I'm butchering that word. Maniad type witch. What do you think about Nancy as a character?
Mm.
Besides for the great Robert Smith cure hair, I think his name is Robert Smith. Besides for the great iconic cure hair and kind of that Madonna jewelry vibe she's got going on.
I think the real lasting appeal of Nancy is how cathartic she is to watch.
Now, what does cathartic mean? For listeners that might not know, what does cathartic mean in response to Nancy here?
Because she is someone who takes things into her own hands and completely just wrecks shop in situations where especially women have been told to shut up and sit down and just let people hurt them.
Okay.
And I mean, to be clear, I do think Nancy takes it too far. She's not a character to be emulated.
So here's an interesting thing, and I notice this in a lot of movies where witchcraft is involved, especially current horror flicks where not necessarily possession, but where people are doing magic. Often, the punishment for even doing the magic is what happens to Nancy, essentially. Nancy's punishment is not because she does the magic, and this is very unique to this film and to a lot of what I've seen of witches in film. It's very witches of Eastwick in a way that using magic is not the punishment. It's when either someone goes too far or dominates over another is when they're punished. Because she's not punished with a high rise that then like eats her house style. Uh, like she is rewarded, but then she's punished when she goes too far. It's very different from kind of the morality of what does it mean to practice witchcraft in even modern day witchcraft horror films that I've seen.
Ultimately, there is an ambition to her because once she has those things, it's not enough for her.
And you don't really notice that in Sarah, Bonnie, or Rochelle. One of the most important scenes to me in this film is the ending scene when Bonnie and Rochelle show up at Sarah's house, and the ambiguity of whether they want friendship or access to power is there. Um, and Sarah still has power because she was, chosen, which is probably a better idea for a deity of having someone that's slightly more even keeled than Nancy. But for me, when I think about Bonnie and Rochelle, and it's kind of telling that Bonnie and Rochelle, I think Bonnie was one of the earlier casts because Neve Campbell had just come off a Party of Five. But Bonnie and Rochelle often kind of feel less actualized in this film than Nancy and Sarah. They feel more like Mary and Sarah from the Sanderson sisters following a lead throughout the film to me. I
Yeah,
could be
they
wrong.
come as a pair most of the time.
I do like the significance of Bonnie's thing being a burn scar because that's really a callback to like true witchiness. Not in a great way, obviously, because people being burned at the stake is not good. But there's something really great about using a burn scar to signify a character's otherness beyond just being the fabulous Neve Campbell. Um,
Mhm.
and I think Bonnie is a great character name. But is there anything about so with Bonnie, you kind of have to talk about trajectory of the film. What do you think about Bonnie's kind of her whole goal was to be pretty? Do you feel like her whole goal was to be pretty and popular to conform? What was Bonnie's goal in being a witch? Or is that even the right question?
I think there is a little bit of an ambiguity with Bonnie. It's very easy for me to read a trans narrative onto her.
Okay, well, yeah, I'd love to talk about that. What do you mean by read a trans narrative? What about Bonnie in this movie reads as trans to you?
Just the desperation that she has to change her body to bring it in line with something she feels inside. But I think once she has it, she kind of loses the plot on why she wanted it to begin with. Because in the initial ritual they do, she talks about it in terms of self-love and of self-acceptance. But then
And
it seems like later in the film, when she no longer has the scars and she is getting attention from boys and things like that, it becomes more about what other people think of her and less about herself.
okay. Do you find significance, and I cannot remember which ritual this is that happens, but there's a scene in the trailer, and I think it's in the final film, where we only see Bonnie's back, and either someone is symbolically wiping the scars off of her body, or like they're actually seeing that the scars are coming off of her skin. I can't remember when that happens, but like I feel like that's a pretty significant moment for her character in the film, and it's a beautifully shot moment. Um,
Mm.
I feel like.
Yeah, when her, I think they said it was an experimental gene therapy. Yeah, and when that works and the actually really well constructed burn prosthetics just sort of flake off and reveal her back, it is a really good scene.
Yeah. And I think they're also like underneath this tree, and it's just that right amount of like daylight, so it has a very like there's almost a soft mystical mythical feel that they pull out of the cinematography for most of this film. Like it doesn't feel like that part of Los Angeles where it's all smog and they built an overpass. It feels like that part of Los Angeles that fights with the nature of the rest of California, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, in I feel like especially in the scenes with this in the city, they focus a lot on things like street art as establishing shots.
Do you
And
have
it,
like a favorite street art that you can think of? Like one that stands out in your mind. Besides that, really great. What is that? There's like a red and orange gold mural that I can see in my mind's eye that I can't. I think it's on the side of the witch shop. I'm not actually sure.
yeah, I was thinking of that one. Yeah.
It's a great. That's also one of my favorite scenes in one of my other favorite '90s film, Pleasantville, where they use street art to completely rebel against status quo, which is a fantastic scene, fantastic movie. If you've never seen it.
Oh,
Um,
I movie.
yeah.
Hey,
So
one I've
so so we have Bonnie, we have Neve Campbell playing her very well. She gets all this popularity. Um, and then it's kind of like Bonnie doesn't quite transform, but Bonnie starts becoming more of a kindred spirit with Rochelle's enemy throughout the film, Laura Lizzie, who's played fantastically by Christine Taylor, who is one of my favorite character actresses that plays soft-hearted and empty really well. Christine Taylor, for those who haven't seen the Brady Bunch spoof movies, she plays the Marcia character, and she does it so well. And Christine Taylor is really great as kind of a B tier villain in The Craft for me because she just has no reason to be evil and cartoony, and she's just cartoony, and then she loses her hair. And it's like the best like if you have someone in high school thinking of revenge and that's the best they can think of, it's so high school, and I actually like it um as like a thing because it shows both how limited and how open the witches are at the same time in a lot of ways.
I think the hair, I mean specifically the choice of her hair falling out as sort of a punishment inflicted by the witches is interesting.
Yeah.
Both because her character's whole thing is that she's a huge racist and she's bullying Rochelle and saying very cruel things about her hair. And
In the original before Rachel True was cast, there was none of that racist aspect either. Is what the Wikipedia page says. I don't know if goes into this in the director's commentary, but they actually made Laura Lizzie racist because they cast Rachel True and she was the last cast witch. I still think I kind of wish the name had been better than Rochelle. I feel like Rachel becoming Rochelle is a little too on the nose. That's a
mhm,
minor complaint in a movie of which I have very few complaints. So
yeah. And it's also interesting because there's a scene in about the midpoint of the film where Sarah is walking past Laura in the hallway and I guess just pulls a chunk of her hair out of spite. And I feel like, and after that is when Laura Lizzie's hair starts falling out in earnest. So I wonder if Sarah's act there kind of shaped what the magic would do.
Yeah. No, I do think this is interesting too because I'm really conflicted on Rochelle as a character because I always get nervous with I don't know how else to say this. The trope is called the magical Negro trope, and I hate saying it, but I don't know what else to say about it. Um, but the scene when Laura Lizzie is weeping in the locker room as her
Mhm.
hair is coming out and she's abandoned, and Rochelle walks by. I think about that scene and I have no context for it, and I can't remember if there's any interaction between them, but just having like this previously unredeemable, vapid bully character just openly weeping in this very vulnerable state. And it's something that Rochelle has caused that Laura doesn't know Rochelle has caused. Like I feel like that's such a powerful scene, and I can never quite pinpoint why that's powerful for me. But I just when I think about the craft, it's one of the scenes I think about is this kind of locker room power dynamic change between Rochelle and Laura.
Yeah. Now instead of bullying Rochelle, she is crying in the shower, wondering what she did to deserve all of this.
And now I can't recall, does Rochelle ever come to Laura's aid? Because then that would really fulfill the trope, and I'd feel probably uncomfortable with that. But do they have any interaction after that point in the movie? Do Rochelle and Laura ever interact again?
They do very briefly. So after all of Laura Lizzie's hair is fallen out and she's wearing a wig, she sort of tentatively says hi to Rochelle when she shows up at the big teen party.
The big teen party where
Yes.
poor Skeet Ulrich is thrown out of a window, which is, I think, a great segue. This is a really so there's two parties in this movie. There is a kind of the earlier kind of party just for the witches, where it's like a oh, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a sleepover. It's more
Yeah.
like it's more classic like teen sleepover teehee kind of voyeuristic. No, and we see them doing the lighter than a feather, stiff as a board thing, which then we saw in movies for a million years after. Um,
It is always at least a little bit gay when you do it in real life.
yes, I would say it's more than a little bit gay, depending upon where your fingers go. But that's what I feel about it. And then we get to this kind of very big, classic, almost an Americana rite of passage, can't hardly wait sort of house party in LA. And this is a big turning point in the movie. This is when things really start to go south. There's an attempted assault because of a love spell. There's Fairuza Balk turning herself into Sarah to take what she thinks she deserves, in my mind. Um, and this is just kind of where the movie flips from that just kind of classic teen rebellion world within a world thing, and it becomes something very dark. Not that Skeet Ulrich's Chris Hooker character is a great guy, but as a catalyst for a change, what did you think about, like, is Chris Hooker memorable enough for you to like feel bad for Chris, or is it just like, well, he's getting what he deserves? As a film where it's very more female gazy than male gazy, is Chris's death like a big deal, or is it just it needed to happen for the plot kind of thing?
I think Chris's death is more indicative of just how far Nancy is willing to go and how out of control she has become. Although this scene where she kills him, it is, I think this scene is one of the reasons this film has endured.
Yeah, but do you?
I don't know anyone who hasn't wanted to say things like that to some man in their life.
Yeah, and he's caused other problems. Like he openly caused problems for Sarah at the beginning of the film. Um, And
Mm,
I don't think I could be wrong, but it's right after their failed date that she sees the person with the snake, right? Like the symbolism is openly there, like it happens one after the other, doesn't it?
hmm. Not sure what when that happens. So initially, at very close to the beginning of the film, this man just sort of wanders into Sarah's house with a snake, and one of my notes over here just says snakes are gay danger in all caps.
I okay. Snakes are gay danger. That may be the episode title for this episode, actually. But it's really interesting too, because I don't think it's that snake, but snakes do come into the ritual later.
Mhm.
Um, as I if I remember, because it's one of the Neve Campbell is holding a butterfly, I think, if I remember the visual of one of them carrying that blue butterfly in kind of the orb vial always sticks with me when I think about their kind of ritual that they do.
Yes, yes, Bonnie is carrying a butterfly, which I mean is another kind of on the nose indicator of transformation.
It's also one of the only times we see a vivid blue in this film, because even the ocean isn't really very blue. It is more of that like silver Californian night day ocean. Like there's of when I think about colors in this film, even the blue tones, unlike that classic Catholic schoolgirl plaid, are muted. And because the four witches barely wear their school outfit, like they're very close to dress code restriction. Uh, Really, that blue butterfly is the only blue that I feel like we really get in the film. Uh,
It's interesting. Although, as someone who attended Catholic school for a couple years, I don't know how those girls didn't get suspended like every single day.
I mean, to be fair, if you had feral Nancy Downs in your school, like it's almost better to have her there than to not know where she is. And also, the other kids at the school are not great. The examples we have of other kids at the school include Skeet Ulrich, Christine Taylor, Nathaniel Marston, and Brecken Meyer as the very mean popular kids. Um,
Yeah,
and so maybe it's just a school full of not great people. Um, that's also possible.
yeah, I think it's just a private school full of rich D bags, except Nancy.
Except Nancy. Nancy is the because one of the characters in Beverly Hills 90210 is from the other side of the tracks, so it's kind of like a trope because you have Ryder Strong Sean character in Boy Meets World, so it's like a coming of age trope to always have one character at your rich or public school that is like not financially well off just so that you can do the capitalism class differential pretty easily. um and then she gets this fabulous high-rise apartment because there's a life insurance payoff. And if it had stopped there, it would have been a very different movie. But like, I could use a fabulous high-rise apartment. I don't
You
know if
know?
I'd want to sacrifice anyone for it, but with prices these days, who knows?
Yeah, I've been sort of keeping in the back of my mind why there weren't any magical repercussions after killing Ray. And I think in her case, it may have very well been a self defense.
Yeah, it's interesting too because the men of the film aren't really the point. And in the 90s, a lot of movies were about men, even something like Dirty Dancing, where it's really from her point of view, is about Patrick Swayze in a lot of ways. So there's something interesting too about the craft as a female gaze centric film, anyways. It's not really about the men. They are there, they provide a service, and the manliest man of all, God, is always watching, whether you want them to or not. Even Manon has almost a male sound to it as the god they invoke. Because it doesn't like, when I think about female deities or female witches, that the kind of this the M and the N sound. Um, so it's very much like this is definitely a female gaze film, and the men kind of almost seem like beside the point. Maybe if it hadn't been Skeet Ulrich, that Nancy and Sarah would have fallen out over something else at some point. Could the center have held, kind of thing.
Hmm. Possibly. And I think that's sort of, in a way, harkening back to older depictions of witches,
Yeah.
sort of centered around a devil figure that is always masculine in some way.
But what's interesting too is you almost have this because this film is so centralized to Los Angeles. You don't really see San Francisco that much. It's very insulated in a way that even Bring It On isn't. In Bring It On, you see so much more of the city and variety of people. In The Craft, it almost has a Terry Pratchett feel to it, where when you have the witches line of books in Terry Pratchett, it's very much about the witches. It's not really warlock centric. It's very female identified. Even their discussion about sex is from a female point of view. And I think that might be why The Craft has such staying power, is that there's not like an explaining male witch, even though there's not as much queer coding in that direction to this. I think in Craft Legacy, I think there's a trans witch in uh, trans male witch in Craft Legacy, if I remember correctly. Like that was like a big casting choice to make sure they had trans. I could be wrong. I didn't see Craft Legacy because I really liked this movie and I didn't want to be disappointed. So I could be very wrong.
I haven't seen Craft Legacy either. I didn't know it had a trans character.
I feel like it does, and I reserve the right to be incorrect about that because it's likely I'm incorrect. But I feel like in the meeting for it, it was very much like they wanted to escape something that makes this movie great, where it's pretty much dedicated female gaze. Like there's no male witch even working in the shop with Lirio. Lirio. I'm gonna butcher that name. There's no male counterpart even at the counter. Like there's not even a Salem Saberhagen male familiar the way that Sabrina Spellman has.
Mhm. Yeah, it is. Yeah, the men in this film exist solely to push the plot forward. They're not particularly fleshed out as characters in and of themselves. But I guess going back to Chris, I think he says more about Sarah's frame of mind than anything else. The fact that she's still kind of mooning over this guy, even though he's been pretty awful to her. And that's who she chooses to focus her magic on.
I mean, he's not unattractive. In the 90s, and even when he came back in Riverdale, Skid Ulrich is not, not bad on the eyes. But
No.
yeah, he's not a good guy in this
Mm-hmm.
movie by any stretch of the imagination. I'm trying to think if he's done any other. Yeah, except for Scream and Riverdale and The Craft, Skeet Ulrich hasn't really done a lot of other. He did a movie called Ride with the Devil, but I don't know if that's a magical movie or not. But yeah, he doesn't do a lot of work in kind of this magical surrealist teen space, except for really The Craft, Scream, and then I would argue Riverdale because it is going for a surrealism thing. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
okay, so
There's
no, go for it. Yeah,
yeah, the only other male character of note is Nancy's stepdad, Ray, and he's just kind of a one note abusive asshole.
he's there to be murdered.
Yeah,
But it's
he's
one
there
of those things. Yeah,
to have the audience not feel bad about it because he sucks.
yeah, and then it is so different from Chris's murder, essentially. Like the murders in the film are so very different that it's almost like you can use the body count to kind of watch Nancy devolve. Uh, and now is like a space where we can talk about scenes. Like we could talk about the really great. This is the only real fast paced scene in the movie too. Is when is when they're basically testing the god and they're in the car and they're going through all the stoplights. This is the only part of the film that I consider urgent. This is the only part where you feel the speed of the film, because even in the final battle, when Sarah's kind of done running and she makes a choice and she's in the mirror, that doesn't necessarily feel as urgent. It feels climactic, but there's a different urgency to the speed, to being in this car. It has a very James Dean Rebel Without a Cause feel to it. Um, it's a
Yeah.
really interesting scene. It just, you don't even need context. Like, there's something about it, like as a standalone scene, where it's about people realizing that nobody's pumping the brakes and now it's too late because you're still in the car, kind of
Mm, absolutely. It sort of shows how Nancy has devolved from, you know, killing her stepdad in, defense of herself and of her mother to killing Chris out of sort of a combination of revenge and jealousy.
thing.
And now she is just willing to casually endanger the lives of everyone around her.
Now, what scenes kind of, so we talked a little bit about the sleepover scene. If you want to talk more about kind of the transformation, the hair color scene, I call it, where Sarah does her hair color change, and then later on, Nancy's like, "And I'm Sarah." It was a quick change moment. But I'd love to talk about, scenes that matter to you, like shots that matter to you. And I want to make sure that things that matter to you about this film kind of get out into the universe. So,
Hmm. Yeah, there is a scene towards the beginning of the film we haven't really touched on yet. There is so after so the snake guy who shows up in the beginning of the film, he shows up again later when the girls are out walking in downtown Los Angeles at night, and he begins chasing Sarah. And there's a moment where all of the girls just stop and look at him for a second, and he gets run over by a car. And they all later admit that they were all thinking that the car was going to hit him. And so it's not just sisterhood that binds them together. There's this kind of shared guilt and complicity that colors their relationship from the beginning.
there's an I still know, I know what you did last summer type of vibe to it a little bit.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
That's another great Sapphic film, really, if you want to get down to it. The Jennifer Love Hewitt films are always great for Sapphic content. Um, yeah. I do love that this film. I love that the craft did hire an actual Wiccan practitioner to make sure that the rituals weren't crazy or cartoonish or wouldn't actually call down a god. Although potentially that did happen because cameras did go out as Fairuza Balk was crying out as Nancy. So who knows? Maybe they did do something. Uh,
There's also when they're doing that ritual out in the park and a bunch of butterflies fly in. Apparently, some real butterflies flew into the shot as well, which really freaked them out.
it's a really great movie, and it's a really meaningful movie. There aren't as many movies about sisterhood that are as dark as this one goes. Even if you think about something like First Wives Club, which is kind of my ultimate hallmark of films about women. This movie is really different from a lot of those female gaze movies just because it allows itself to be really dark. And in a world where it almost feels like when you see a movie about women, it almost excuses women's friendships. This film really feels like it shows the complicated nature of female relationships, and I really like it for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of an exploration of teen girl dynamics and just how much viciousness there can really be in there.
Also, that they're as short-sighted as boys, which is really nice because Nancy's hyper focused on power and more as it happens. But like I said at the beginning, when you look at Bonnie and Rochelle's motivations, and even Sarah's in some way, because like she could have wanted, peace or to forget her past, but her big spell really before she kind of gives herself to the deity is capturing Chris's heart and embarrassing him in the chaplain school prayer hour thing that none of those kids look like they're into anyways. So
Yeah. Let's see. And I think, you see, one more thing. I did want to go back to the snakes.
the snakes. Oh yes. So
So
is it? Yeah, go for it.
Nancy is shown to be connected with snakes. She brings a snake with her to the ritual. And I think that's a little bit more of that twinning with Sarah, who reveals at one point in the film that she's hallucinated snakes in the past. And again, snakes become the way that they magically torment each other during their final confrontation.
And they include rats in that final confrontation because a lot of times people think about the um Nancy turning into like roaches because of Sarah's new power type of thing. But there's also rats, which are naturally eaten by snakes that are kind of a part of the torment leading up to the final. Uh, and this is the part Roger Ebert hated was the final battle, by the way. What did you think of this final battle? Do you think it adds something to the film? Do you wish it were different?
I think it I think it does add to the film because at this point in the story, Bonnie and Rochelle have bailed because this has gotten to be too much for them. And so Sarah is trying to bind Nancy with magic so that she can't cause any more harm. And this causes Nancy to just go completely wild and start flying through the air and try to kill her.
Which when she says later I'm flying as she's like in the insane asylum is just not just a really great call to Hellraiser 2, but it's just a really great kind of finite point on her because even with all the money and power that she accrued, it wasn't enough and it led to her insanity. We got 5 minutes left, so I just want to let you have these 5 minutes to talk about either why people should see the film, more about why this matters to me. Just like this is your time to kind of talk about your heart for this film and why it matters to you, why it mattered to a whole subset of people even outside of 96 because it was a hit, but you didn't see it until the 2000s. So why does this film matter? What about it is the reason you wanted to spend an hour and change talking about it?
I think that I think this film matters and it has an enduring appeal because in part it's a power fantasy. It's about four downtrodden and marginalized people who discover a means to power and they can use it to make their lives better. And I think that's an empowering message for a lot of people. But it's also very much a story about how do you use power when you have it, and what happens to the friendships that you build if you start valuing power over them. There's also just so many very long gazes and weird little smiles and innuendo, especially between Sarah and Nancy.
Do you ever feel like you've gone through the phases of being the four different, which is like, have you been a Rochelle one day and then a Nancy the next? Do you feel like these 4 points of the compass really are for different points of the compass?
In some ways, I know the filmmakers did choose to align the girls each to different elements, but I think they all, well, I think Sarah and Nancy definitely reflect two different ways you can react to adversity and either grow from it or sort of remain in a eternal crisis mode and become destructive.
All right. Yeah. So that is The Craft, 1996's ode to learning how to exercise your rights, or if you've got the movie poster, Welcome to the Witching Hour. This is a film that did not, it really leaned into itself. It was not shy about what it was. And at an hour 41 minutes, it's almost the perfect length for a film, too, which I really love. I want to thank you for joining me, Jack, and for talking about The Craft with me.
Well,
Uh,
thank you. This was a lot of fun.
I'm glad. Yeah, it's a lot of fun, but no one is getting smashed out of a plate glass window. So that's good, clean, wholesome fun. For all you listeners out there, have you seen The Craft? Did you enjoy it? Did it make you question yourself? Did it make you try witchcraft? Did you have a satanic panic in your town because of it in '96? Or did it just turn you on to some of the best alt bands in the '90s? I want to thank everyone for listening in to this special edition of Everything is Gay, Even the Straight Stuff. And just remember, if you're going to bring animals to the ritual, they should probably be alive at the time.